Thank you for everyone who made this event happen. I'm really happy to be here and discuss topic I know quite well, according to a perspective that I've never tried before, so it's a bit new for me. My previous work has dealt extensively with the question of the late antique legacy in what can be called the spiritual program of the Quran. In many passages, the Arabic text develops the idea that God, who remains, of course, essentially unknowable, voluntarily and graciously manifests himself in the world by means of two intermediaries, scripture, that is prophetic revelation, and nature, that is creation. This dual mode of revelation of the God to human beings is crystallized by the notion of ayat, signs, a technical term used several hundred times in the Quran, designating cosmic and scriptural points of revelations. As described by Toshihiko Isutsu, these signs constitute means of communication between God and man. In a way, they are the interface between the visible and the invisible, the intersection between two inseparable and intertwined orders of reality, the divine and the mundane. By graciously and generously disposing his ayat in creation and revelation, God makes himself manifest to mankind and gives humans the opportunity to seek his face and allegedly know him partially. I have argued elsewhere that, historically speaking, this invitation to contemplation seems connected to the late antique Christian ascetic tradition that emerged with the Alexandrian fathers, Clement and Origen, of course, was theorized in the 4th century with well-known authors such as the Cappadocian Fathers and, of course, Evagrius of Pontus, and was received and adapted over the following centuries within the Christian world. These Christian spiritual masters had indeed developed early on the idea of a twofold divine revelation, scriptural and natural, mirroring one another. This model had a lasting influence on later spiritual traditions, and it would thus not be surprising that the Quran furthers this tradition in its own way. I never aimed at approaching the Quran, and even less the sign passages, from a diachronic perspective. I have always been more inclined in focusing on the late antique background of the text without paying too much attention to its redactional process. This reflects my personal interests, which rather lies in phenomena of late antique legacy in the Quran. However, I believe that there is probably much room for such an analytical perspective on sign passages. I am certainly not the best equipped in this room to carry out such a task, but I will take the opportunity of this conference to highlight future avenues in this regard. My goal in this paper will be to provide you with an overview of the very few examples of sign passages in the 7 long ones. In the first part of my paper, I will compare these passages with the genre in the rest of the corpus. I will then discuss their distinctive characteristics. Finally, I will reflect more broadly on two different kinds of cosmological passages that I think the Quran displays, both of which are, in my eyes, represented in the 7 long ones. As everyone is well aware, the expression sign passages usually refer in the secondary literature to pericopes that are nothing but enumerations of cosmic items and phenomenon that the authors of the Quran take as evidence of God's steering of the universe. They typically list any kind of natural objects: the sky, the earth, the sun, the moon, stars, the night and the day, rains, sea, water in general, mountains, trees, camels, fruits, date palms, grains, etc. Although these passages vary very much in length and in content throughout the Quran, one of their common features is that they are almost systematically closed by a distinctive formula, putting stress on the fact that the items listed are indeed signs for a people who reflect, who ponder, who remember, who think. According to my opinion, these formulas reflect the necessary spiritual engagement of the believer through his spiritual heart so as to grasp the divine in the cosmos. Depending on inclusion criteria, the Quranic corpus comprises between 50 and 60 sign passages. Most of them belong to surahs traditionally considered Meccan. More precisely, based on Nöldeke and Schwalli's chronology, it is possible to affirm that the genre of sign passages, which exist already in the early Meccan period, seems to gain in popularity only from the middle Meccan period onwards to reach its peak during the latest stage of the career of Muhammad in Mecca. Approximately 7 such passages are identified as belonging to the early Meccan period, around 18 to the middle Meccan period, and 31 to the late Meccan period. In contrast, the Medinan period contains only around 10 examples of the genre, and the number is much smaller yet if one accepts the classical hypothesis that of Meccan insertions and additions in Medinan surahs. Strictly speaking, I have only counted 4 sign passages in the 7 long ones, in Surah 2, Surah 3, 6, and 7. To this can be added a few other passages, such as one passage in Surah 6 and another in Surah 7, which present certain similarities with the genre, but do not contain the usual closing formula I just alluded to. Thus, we have 2 passages belonging to Meccan surahs and 2 belonging to Medinan surahs. Yet, according to Nöldeke and Schwalli, the sign passage mentioned in Surah 2 is likely part of a larger Meccan insertion running from verses 163 to 171. This would thus leave verses 189 to 191 of Surah 3 as the only Medinan sign passage in the 7 long ones. Formally speaking, these texts are relatively short. Unlike the extensive developments observed in certain Meccan surahs, such as the beginning of Surah 16, none of the sign passages in the 7 long ones reach a length comparable to the longest sign passages of the Quran. From a content perspective, these pericopes are quite similar to those found in the rest of the corpus. Most cosmic elements listed therein find parallels in other surahs of the Quran. They are often conveyed with similar turns of phrases. Among the signs mentioned in there, one finds, for instance, the creation of heaven and earth, the alternation of day and night, or else the ship sailing across the sea. A few of them convey the idea that clouds bring rainfalls, which are signs of God's generosity and benevolence. The short sign passage found in Surah 3 showcases singular details worth discussing. To God belongs the kingdom of heavens and earth. God is powerful over everything. Surely in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and in the alternation of the night and the day, there are signs indeed for those with understanding, who remember God, whether standing or sitting or lying on their sides, and reflect on the creation of the heavens and the earth. O Lord, you have not created this in vain. Glory to you, guard us against the punishment of the fire. Though quite short in terms of cosmic items listed, the typical closing formula, "these are signs indeed for those with understanding," is paraphrased and somehow commented upon by the following clause: "those who remember, whether standing or sitting or lying on their sides, and reflect on the creation of the heavens and the earth." This tripartite formula was certainly coined on a turn of phrase found in Deuteronomy 6:7. I showed elsewhere that this verse became a common scriptural reference among Christian spiritual and ascetic authors in late antiquity to illustrate the attitude of remembrance of God, a well-known concept of Christian asceticism, known in Greek as mnemeteu and in Syriac as urdana or dukrana de Allah. It is thus certainly not by chance that the verb yatkuruna is employed in this passage of the Quran. The author clearly seeks to illustrate the spiritual attitude of remembrance of God, to grasp God's signs by means of a paraphrase of this biblical expression. This is confirmed by the only other occurrence of the term, whether standing or sitting, the turn whether standing or sitting or lying on their sides, which occurs in Surah 4, verse 103, in a passage describing the proper attitude in and after prayer. The author of this passage in Surah 3 is clearly accustomed with technical terms and motifs used in the context of ascetic and spiritual practices. He seems also aware of how these concepts were illustrated in the authentic ascetic literature. Of the remaining signed passages, the one found in Surah 6 is certainly the strangest. I won't read it like entirely here, but this passage presents 3 occurrences of the typical closing formula in a 4-verse span. This is not the only example of such a phenomenon in the text, but it should certainly be considered in the light of a few other oddities. Indeed, there is a clear break in verse length in this pericope, as verse 99 is 4 times longer than the previous 3 ones, and switches right in the middle from a reference to God in the third person to a first person plural. Content-wise, there is an unusual listing of different kinds of fruits and trees in this verse, in verse 99. References to fruits and trees are, of course, common in the Quran, but those passages are generally much less detailed. A few verses across the text mention that God has brought forth fruit as provision for humans, and 2 passages of Surah 16 are more precise and mention olives, date palms, and grapes. Yet, the verse 99 of Surah 6 remains unparalleled, especially linguistically. The term kinwan, used to refer to clusters of dates, is a hapax. Beside, the term rumman, designating pomegranates, is only attested 3 times in the text. One occurrence is found in Surah 55, and the other is found in the only other quasi-signed passage of Surah 6, which runs from verse 141 to 144. Both verses indeed share the characteristic of being very detailed about vegetation, gardens, and fruits benefiting humans. It is who produces gardens, trellised, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, trellised or untrellised, and date palms and crops of diverse produce, and olives and pomegranates, alike and different. Eat from its fruits when it bears fruit, and give it its due portion on the day of its harvest. But do not act wantonly. Surely he does not love the wanton. Something that struck my attention in this passage, and a few others of the 7 long ones, is the great deal of effort put in there to stress the fact that God has created variations in creation for the benefit of human beings. The passage of the verse 99 of Surah 6 insists, for instance, on the fact that in the variety of fruit trees listed, some look alike and some do not. I don't know if I... Yeah. Through the expression mushtabihan wa ghayr mutashabihin. The expression is sometimes understood as meaning looking alike in shape but dissimilar in taste. The very same expression concerning trees is found in the verse 141 of the same surah, which also stresses the distinction between gardens that are trellised and untrellised by the same turn of phrase, marushatin wa ghayr marushat. Curiously, this distinctive turn of phrase, which I have named X wa ghayr X, seems to have been triggered by the thematic of gardens and fruits in the Quran. We find a similar construct in Surah 13, where the text talks about palm trees growing in bunches and not in bunches, through the same expression. The only other occurrence of this structure, linguistic structure, is found in the obscure passage of Surah 22, verse 5, dealing with the creation of man from dust, then from a drop, then from a clot, and then from a lump, formed and unformed. Mukhalakatin wa ghayr mukhalakatin. Strikingly, the very same verse ends with a reference to the growing plants of every beautiful kind. مِكُلِّ زَوْجٍ بَهِيجٍ. There is, I think, a clear connection between these different passages, betrayed by shared linguistic structures and unparalleled botanic fascination. Without entering in the debate of whether Surah 6 needs to be read as a coherent whole, or if the common feature found across this chapter reflect a later editorial activity, I believe that the emphasis put in verse 99 and 141 on the variety of fruits and different kinds of gardens is well understood in the light of the recurring challenges made throughout the surah by the unbelievers, who are said to reject the signs of God and keep challenging the Quranic messenger to provide them with a sign. In verse 37, 109, 124, and 158. Emphasis is put on the futility of providing them with signs. The unbelievers seem to be asking for signs that are actually miracles. Their incapacity to recognize prophetic signs and the divine showing in the cosmos, especially through the diversity of the natural order, which speaks for itself, according to the author, makes the challenge even more pointless. No need to have signs sent down by God if they are already there. Be that as it may, these two passages of Surah 6 are not the only ones referring to fruits and vegetations. In Surah 7, the text also refers to it in establishing a typology between, on the one hand, resurrection, and on the other hand, vegetation and fruits growing on good land. Again, the passage is quite long. I won't read it like entirely. But the reference made in verse 57 to water revivifying barren land is a well-known typological motif in the Quran. But it is never followed by a reference to God's ability to make fruit grow, as if what was pointing towards resurrection was not the revivification of the land itself, but more precisely God's ability to make fruit come forth. Pullman suspects that the passage witnesses a form of editorial activity based on turns of phrases, similar turns of phrases found in Surah 25 and 35, which are already close to the formulation of the Surah 7. But as he notes, the idea is quite distinct here, as the bringing forth of trees and fruit by God is taken as evidence that he will also be able to bring forth the dead. There is, I think, evidence that this passage of Surah 7 is the result of an interpolation. Before trying to explain why, I would like to give a hypothetical explanation of what may have triggered the association of resurrection with the bringing forth of fruits in the author's mind. I think this metaphor is probably due to the author's picturing, the divine creative activity as a splitting phenomenon, a splitting process. For this, I recommend an article written by Geneviève Gobillot on the notion of fitra. If this hypothesis is correct, it is worth highlighting that the same representation of creative activity is expressed, this time explicitly, in the opening of the sign passage of Surah 3, which we discussed earlier. Where God's ability to bring forth creation from barren land is compared to the splitting of date seed and grain to bring forth trees. Surely God is a splitter of the grain and the date seed. He brings forth the living from the dead and bring forth the dead from the living. That is God. How are you so deluded? The typological association between grain splitting and resurrection is made plain by the sentence, he bring forth the living from the dead and the dead from the living, which finds exact parallel elsewhere in the text. Curiously, this typological reading of the cosmos ends abruptly in the next verse, verse 96, where the focus turns to God's bounty expressed through cosmic phenomena. Night and day were made by God respectively for rest and reckoning, and stars were made so that humans might be guided by them in the darkness of the shore and the sea. The signs are not types anymore. They are simply encouragements to embrace an ethical behavior of thankfulness towards God. A similar yet distinct rupture seems to occur in the passage of Surah 7 studied earlier. The whole passage from verse 54 to 57 clearly adopts a typological reading of cosmic signs. The fact that God created the heaven and the earth in 6 days is certainly a sign that he will be able to create a second time. To him belongs the creation and the command, the text says. The winds allowing clouds to be driven towards barren land typify God's mercy. The revivification of barren land then foreshadows the resurrection. The motif is indeed well attested in the Quran. The ones who take heed or remember can decipher such cosmic phenomenon as a type of future revival of the dead. Curiously, the next verses develop a motif that does no more illustrate resurrection, but rather retribution. Verse 78 says, "As for the good land, its vegetation comes forth by the permission of its Lord, but as for the bad, its vegetation comes forth only poorly. In this way, we vary the signs for a people who are thankful." One can easily see the connection with verse 57, as both verses build on vegetal imagery. But even though coherent in itself, this verse 58 looks strange in this place. It is even actually unfortunate, as it clearly weakens the point made in verse 57. Why indeed would God revivify a barren soil, an allegedly bad one thus, if we follow the verse 58, and bring vegetation forth at all, if it really were a metaphor for unbelief? I am tempted to think that the two distinctive arguments were likely sticked on account that both resorted to the vegetal imagery. Note that the point made in verse 58 finds illustration in the different pericopes of Straflegenden, starting from verse 59. There we learn that only few people recognize God's signs in the mouth of successive prophets across sacred history, and were saved, while the remaining blind part of them, who had called the signs of the Lord a lie, succumbed. In conclusion, one might argue that even though being an unpopular genre in the seven long ones, the few sign passages displayed therein reveal to be good illustrations of the research question that gathers us today. While their composition reminds in many ways the sign passages of the rest of the corpus, they also clearly display thematic emphasis that are less common. From a structural perspective, I am tempted to argue that the examples of Surah 6 and 7 bear the traces of editorial interventions, but what strikes me the most in these four examples is the different purposes for which they are used. It is usually argued that what the signified of the cosmic signs it is usually argued that the cosmic signs usually signify God's ability to maintain the universe in existence and provide humans with necessary sustenance. The alternance of the night and the day, the sun, the moon, cattle, etc., simply signify God's economy. In such cases, signs do not have particular meaning. They should not be read in any sort of symbolic or allegorical ways. They simply signify the Creator's benevolence towards mankind, which in turn encourages them to be thankful and engage in practice. Yet, many sign passages throughout the text adopt a typological reading of the cosmos. These passages stress how cosmic phenomena, when properly looked upon, point towards God's ability to make life emerge from dead-looking things, vegetation from barren land, date palms from seeds, etc., thus providing hope for the second creation. The stress is not put here on sustenance of mankind, but rather on the promise of the future resurrection. Both readings of the universe are not necessarily antithetic, but reveal different emphasis, one more ethical, for it stresses the necessity to be thankful, and the other more typological, stressing the necessity to find in the cosmic patterns the foreshadowing of the world to come. The 4 sign passages in the 7 long ones yield examples of both kinds. The examples of Surah 2, which I haven't discussed here, and 7 clearly opt for a typological reading of creation. The one in Surah 3 rather belongs to the ethical kind of, as it stresses, as we saw, the connection between reflection upon the cosmos and the proper practice of remembrance of God. In this respect, the example of Surah 6 certainly is a In this respect, the example of Surah 6 certainly is a hybrid example. While beginning with an explicit typological association between God's ability to revive what's dead and his ability to make trees and fruit emerge from dead seeds, it also emphasizes the benefit humans draw from the cosmic order and the variety of fruit trees created by God. I'm not quite sure that I can really attribute these different approaches to sign reading to different periods of redactions. But I think that future research taking into consideration this dichotomy and trying to make sense of it in the broader context of the spiritual program of the Quran may yield interesting results. My intuition is that it may well have something to do with another topic on which the Quran is not as monolithic as one may think, namely its stance on the question of divine knowledge acquisition. That is, however, a different subject that I cannot discuss here. Thank you very much.